You're listening to the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. It's fast, fun, free, daily deep dive Bible, and right now we're working on the book of Nehemiah. If you're new, welcome. You can jump in right here, or you can always go back and start at the beginning of any season. The whole podcast is available in an easy-to-use format at thetmbh.com.
Have you ever been in a spot where something goes wrong or you have a customer service need with somebody and the only way to get it addressed is that you have to call a call center and you got to navigate the whole intricate labyrinth of who's in what position and eventually you get to somebody. And that somebody listens to your story. It's like the fifth time you've told it. They are empathetic. And they're like, all right, yeah, this is the solution. This is what we're going to do. What is the very next thing you say after you get the answer you want in that situation? It's, could I have that in writing, right? Could you just pop that into an email for me real quick and send that before we get off the phone just to make sure that we're both right there on the same page? Getting it in writing is when you go from an agreement in principle that sounds real nice to an actual thing that's binding and it's real and it's enforceable. And getting it in writing is what we've been talking about last time around and now this time around as we look at Nehemiah chapter 2. In the early going of Nehemiah chapter 2, the conversation goes great. The king responds wonderfully to Nehemiah's emotion or emotional state. His wife, the queen, doesn't step in to intervene and be like, no, don't act hastily, dear king. No, it just rolls right through. Everything goes great. But it doesn't really matter very much, now does it, if Nehemiah says to himself, all right, well, I was there. I mean, the king said it. The queen would probably vouch for me. They'd probably remember that. Well, I mean, maybe. So I'm just going to go. I'm going to take my trip. I'm going to head out the door right now. I'm going to go talk to some military people, tell them they have to come with me now. I'm going to go get building supplies and fund it with the royal treasury. No, it's ridiculous. You got to get the orders written. You got to get the whole thing in writing so that it is real and so that the will of the king will extend. And how do you do that? Well, work orders and receipts. And last time around, I was telling you that receipts from the Persian world are something that you can still see. You can still hold that in your hand. And as we look at the brass tacks part of this conversation between Nehemiah and the king, I got to imagine that there's some of these little clay shard receipts rattling around in his pocket as he goes on his trip because he was going to need to show this stuff to a lot of people along the way. Here's a passage I'm talking about. The brass tacks portion starts in Nehemiah 2:7. This is Nehemiah, first person, talking about what happened as he was talking with King Artaxerxes of Persia. I also said to him, if it pleases the king, may I have letters to the governors of Trans-Euphrates so that they will provide me with safe conduct until I arrive in Judah. And may I have a letter to Asaph, keeper of the king's forest, so he will give me timber to make beams for the gates of the citadel by the temple and for the city wall for the residence I will occupy. Okay, so three things here that Nehemiah wants to build, but he's not really asking permission to build these three things. He's asking permission for the work order. He's asking permission to use the resources of the kingdom, and there's no appearance that the king balks as Nehemiah is saying, okay, as discussed, we're going to need to make the timber for the beams for the gates of the citadel, and we're going to need to obviously take care of that wall we discussed. But implicitly here, this is kind of what he's saying. Obviously, I'll be the temporary governor or like a regional representative of the king while I'm there, and I'm going to need some sort of residence to indicate that. Is he just being greedy? Well, if culturally this was a greedy ask, then I think the king sours on the deal at this point. I think rather what we're seeing here is the theme of Nehemiah's request is, I need these things to make it official. And I suspect that having some sort of residence that is evocative of a representative of the king would be in keeping with the spirit of having these documents and these letters and these receipts and these work orders and traveling with a royal retinue. Like, you're not going to travel with a royal retinue and then go stay in a dumpy tent in the slums of Jerusalem. That makes the king look bad. And I also got to think that beyond the request to just rebuild the city as the king's representative, I mean, how has Nehemiah framed it? It's the place where his fathers are buried. This is my ancestral home. Obviously, I mean, what kind of son would I be if I went back and I didn't rebuild our home in some way at the same time? I suppose maybe he's pushing his luck here, but I think it makes sense given the context, and it makes sense given the moment they are in the conversation, which is the brass tacks moment. Can we get this in writing? Not just because I think you're going to violate my trust, O great king, the second I turn around. No, that's not the case. The king is Nehemiah's champion in this whole endeavor. The whole endeavor is happening, because Nehemiah is going to say here in a minute that God providentially prompted the heart of the king to do it. Now, Artaxerxes isn't the problem here. It's all the people who are far, far away from Artaxerxes and Artaxerxes' tether, even though he has their earth and water in a little jar on his shelf. The tether gets weaker the further from Susa you're going to get. And both of these men know that. And so having it in writing is going to be a very important thing. What does that in writing look like? Well, resource-wise, one of the things that's going to convey the authority of the king is coinage, which, interestingly enough, wasn't really a Persian thing until they had contact with the Greeks in Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey. There was a guy named Croesus who reigned during the age of Cyrus the Great, going on about 100 years before the events we're looking at in Nehemiah. And, there's a saying, rich is Croesus. This guy was loaded. When Cyrus saw the efficiency of the way he had coined precious metals, that was something that set in motion the Persians beginning to adopt that. Persian coinage is a thing, but that was primarily used to conduct international business. We learn that from Herodotus. It's not a terribly interesting passage where we learn that, but dang, do I have time to tell you this now? No, let's put a pin in it. There's something else that I found in Herodotus that totally relates to the relationship between Haman and Mordecai that we talked about in the book of Esther. I'm going to tease it, but we'll get to that next time around. Let's finish the receipts thing for now. So coinage would have been part of the deal, but that was more for international relations primarily, according to Herodotus. Of course, coinage is easier to move. That's part of the advantage of money, is you can have a handful of coins and it can represent a gigantic weight, a gigantic volume of practical goods, and it's expensive to move the practical goods when you could just move the coinage and be like, all right, I got all this wheat right here, but I want to send this wheat 1,000 miles away. I could do that, or I could give you 2 gold coins and you can buy the exact same amount of wheat somewhere else or in another economy. You get it. You know how money works. So no doubt Nehemiah was going to be equipped with money, but the bigger question in his mind seems to be the king's resources and the wood. What's really interesting is we don't get a ton about Persia just from history. You and I have lamented that quite a bit together. There's not tons of ancient or original sources. We have to cobble it together. But one thing that we have in spades from the Persian Empire is receipts. In fact, we got so many receipts that most of them aren't even translated. A tiny percentage have been translated. People have been working on it for 100 years, 150 years. There's multiple different troves, including one that we're going to talk about right now that was found in the ruins of Persepolis. They did their receipts on clay tablets, and that's part of why we still get to know what they're about. Those little weird oil-based receipts that are heat printed that you and I use, they don't age well. As soon as they're exposed to heat, you've seen what happens when you put one of those on the dash. They just melt and turn black. It doesn't work because they're printed with heat in the first place, so more heat wrecks them. Well, eventually, through history, everything old gets exposed to heat. But what happens when you further heat up a clay tablet that is etched with a reed? Well, nothing. It hardens more. I don't know. I suppose it depends on the chemical content or the exact style of clay. But a lot of the fires that eventually burned these libraries or record-keeping centers only made the receipts stay in better shape. So as a result, we just got mountains and mountains of these receipts, no doubt hundreds, thousands of which would have been involved in the transactions associated with Nehemiah's endeavor. And a few of these that have been translated I've got here right in front of me. Here's one. I'm looking at like 5 different sides of this one. And it is translated 27 maras of wine supplied by Muska Dauka, the Martyrdom, I don't know what that means, of Nariapikna, received and took it to the palace of Parnamatis. What does all of that mean? I don't know, but I can tell it's a receipt, right? I don't know where those places are. I don't know what that one word meant that I bumbled over a couple times. But I know a receipt when I see it. And this is totally in keeping with what we learned from the ancient historians, that so much of what Persian officials were paid happened in wine and grain. That was wealth. Coin was often secondary because the king owned everything. That was the style of the Achaemenid Empire. Here's another one. 30 meris of wine supplied by Tisentama received and took it to the palace of Parnamatis for the royal food supply. Here's another example. 4 sheep as tax were taken from the place of Maturban to Susa. Apisuka received them 22nd year. So there you have it. There's some of the actual language from actual artifacts from this moment of time that gives you a sense of how all the people behind the scenes in this story would have behaved and thought about transactions and commerce and delivery and work orders. And this little chit-chat, where we get it in writing between Artaxerxes and Nehemiah, was going to send a bajillion little number crunchers, bean counters, work order writers off to their desks, etching away at these bits of clay pottery to put all of this in motion. It was a huge administrative, bureaucratic task to accomplish what Nehemiah was asking and Artaxerxes was ordering. And who knows, maybe some of these little tablets right here were in some way involved in that transaction. If they weren't, they at least give us a real good sense of what it looked like when Nehemiah got this project in writing, a project that, as we'll see, echoes all the way into this moment of our life right now, 2,400 years and change after it went down. This isn't just, I'm going to build a house, I'm going to put some walls up. This is one that has massive implications that we'll look at more as we go along. See, I told you, receipts can be fun. I love them. It's a blast. All right, I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour Podcast. Let's do this again soon.